So I'll show you how I set up this instrument rack. I've renamed Serum's Macro 2. I've called it envelope-LFO. You could call it modulation mode or something like that. I'll press configure, and the first thing I'll touch is that one. And it's calling it Macro 2, which will be confusing later because we're going to map it to Macro 1 of the Ableton instrument rack. Second thing I'll touch is envelope 2's attack. Third thing I'll touch is the LFO rate. Then envelope 2 decay, and after that, the direct macro. After that, I'm going to go into the matrix and I'm going to configure all of these output sliders for all of envelope 2's modulation mappings. So we'll turn that off because we're done configuring our VST window. And we're going to group this VST by pressing Command G to turn it into an instrument rack in Ableton so that we can set up some macros. So the first macro mapping we're going to make is from Macro 2 here, and hilariously, we're going to map it to Macro 1 in the instrument rack. If this is confusing, just remember it shouldn't be called Macro 2 still, because we renamed it, but it seems that the VST window doesn't take note of that. Not to worry, we can rename it manually. Second mapping we're going to make is the envelope 2 attack, and because the envelope and the LFO are never going to be working at the same time, this second macro is going to be a dual purpose macro, and we're also going to map the LFO rate to it, and we'll rename it attack/rate. And whether it is the attack or the rate depends on the position of macro 1, envelope LFO. Next, we'll map envelope 2 decay to macro 3, and then we'll map macro 1, which if you remember, it's the direct modulations, to macro 4 on the instrument rack. And I'll name it direct. And here's the part where we're going to work around the fact that Serum doesn't have modulations of modulations of modulations. We're going to get that third level modulation with Ableton's instrument rack. So we're going to map all these mod outs to the first macro, envelope/LFO, and then I'm going to press map, open up the browser, and I'm going to change the polarity of all these mod out mappings so that they run in the opposite direction. Check if my rack is working, check under the hood to see if it's working there, and I'm ready to test it. The LFO sounds incredible. How's my envelope? I'll get rid of the attack, and I need to put the decay up to something, otherwise I won't hear it. And you can hear how the different velocities of my keystrokes are changing the extent to which envelope 2 is changing the sound. LFO, check. Envelope, check. Gonna turn them both off by putting this in the middle, and now I'm gonna test out my direct macro. Golden. So that's how I set up my Serum presets. Whether it's a sound that involves only one modulation, for example to the filter cutoff, or whether it's a preset that has 7 different modulations like this one. I always make sure there's 3 different ways to make that modulation happen. The LFO, the envelope, and the direct control. And I map these to the first 4 faders on my MIDI controller the same way each time, so that I know when I'm performing that if I go to the very left fader, that's my modulation mode. The next one over is the attack of the envelope or the rate of the LFO. The next one over from that is the envelope decay. And then the 4th one is going to be my direct control. And just like a musical instrument, it'll give me predictable results as long as I stick to this template.